Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Dr. Michael Rabbidge from the University of Waikato in New Zealand, and I'm honoured to present at Korea TESOL 2025. My talk today explores how translanguaging can be used to empower multilingual identities in ELT, particularly within the context of Korean university classrooms. The core of this presentation is based on a narrative inquiry project I conducted with first year English education students at a university in Seoul in conjunction with a student I was supervising. These students that were the participants of the study were learning English in a classroom where the instructor encouraged them to draw from their full linguistic repertoires. What emerged from this research was an incredibly rich set of insights, not only into how students use language to make meaning, but how they use it to express who they are. So let's begin by zooming out a little. Globalization has dramatically reshaped the landscape of higher education. We now see increased academic mobility, international collaboration, and the widespread use of English as a medium of instruction. In South Korea, English is everywhere, compulsory in schools, pivotal on the CSAT, and embedded in university admissions and curricula. As Kim notes, EMI is now common across many institutions, with universities offering degrees taught almost entirely in English. But this English dominance, what Kim and others call English fever, has a dark side. It contributes to educational inequality and social stratification. As Chang and Park argue, English is no longer just a skill, it's a form of symbolic capital tied to neoliberal values. It marks you as competitive, employable, and modern. And so students are pressured not just to learn English, but to internalize it as part of who they are. This creates a context where English is both a gatekeeper and a performance. It's no wonder that students' emotional and identity-based responses to English are complex and deeply felt. So where does translanguaging fit into this picture? At its core, translanguaging is the practice of using multiple languages fluidly within a single communicative or learning event. But it's more than that. It's also a way of thinking about language, not as a set of separate named systems, but as a dynamic integrated repertoire that multilinguals draw from in real time. In Korean ELT, translanguaging is still underutilized. Traditional classroom approaches tend to follow a monolingual ideology, what Park refers to as English-only pedagogies. Students are often discouraged from using Korean in class, even when it would help them express ideas more clearly or feel more secure. But emerging research, including my own, suggests that translanguaging can do powerful things. It can reduce anxiety, increase participation, and help students feel seen and valued. It also challenges power structures by legitimizing Korean as a valid academic language. In this way, translanguaging is not just a pedagogical technique, it's an emotional, social, and political act. It allows students to resist dominant language ideologies and reposition themselves as competent multilinguals. So this study set out to ask a very focused question. How do the translanguaging perceptions and practices of Korean ELT students influence and reflect their own developing language identities? To answer this, I adopted a theoretical lens that understands language as an embodied phenomenon, something tied not only to thought and meaning, but to identity, emotion, and lived experience. I also drew on positioning theory, which looks at how people position themselves and others in discourse, claiming rights, fulfilling duties, negotiating roles. When students use Korean in an English class, they're not just speaking their L1, they're taking a stand. They're saying, I have the right to communicate clearly. I have the duty to contribute. I'm not a deficient learner. I'm a capable multilingual speaker. The study used a narrative inquiry approach to explore how students' translanguaging practices reflected and shaped their language identities. We worked with 16 Korean university freshmen enrolled in an English education program. All students completed narrative frames reflecting on their experiences with English and Korean in the classroom. We then selected 5 students for follow-up interviews based on their level of engagement and depth of their initial reflections. In addition, we conducted classroom observations to see how language practices occurred in real time. Importantly, the classroom context was unique. The lecturer explicitly promoted translanguaging. He encouraged students to use Korean when needed and to draw on their full repertoire for expression and understanding. So this wasn't a normal English-only environment. It was a space where students were granted English agency. For analysis, we used thematic analysis, triangulating across narrative frames, interview transcripts, and observation notes. We also used member checking to ensure that our interpretations aligned with how students saw their own experiences. So let's get on to the results. One of the clearest themes in the data was how students used their full linguistic repertoires, or FLRs, to express themselves with greater clarity, emotion, and nuance than English alone would allow. Ji-hyun, for example, noted that using only English creates limitations when trying to express opinions. She said, using only English may limit expressions of opinions. Position yourself as a communicator with the right to use all available resources in the pursuit of meaningful interaction. This kind of identity position reflects theories on positioning that see students as not just passively receiving language policies, but rather students actively negotiating their roles, their duties, and their rights in real time. In this case, Ji-hyun's duty is to be clear and expressive. Her right is to access Korean when her English falls short. Similarly, Ah-young emphasized the emotional register of her language use. There are emotions or quotes that English cannot replace, she states. In this, we can see the embodied nature of language, how emotion, cognition, and identity interweave when language choices are made. Ji-won said he uses Korean when he can't think of the right expression. A simple yet powerful moment that speaks to the cognitive strain of second language use. Translanguaging becomes a relief valve, ensuring the speaker's intent isn't lost in the limits of L2 processing. Hyun-mi adds a broader call for structural support when she states, professors should allow Korean when students can't think of English words. This isn't just about ease, it's about educational equity. When learners aren't given space to draw on their full identities, they are, in effect, being asked to operate with less than what they actually know. These findings reflect what Garcia and Wei argue, that translanguaging isn't only a linguistic phenomenon, it's also a political phenomenon. It contests the idea that English should dominate academic spaces and instead frames language learning as a fluid, lived, and inclusive process. Another strong theme was resistance to monolingual norms. Students didn't just use Korean pragmatically, they used it to preserve cultural integrity, challenge power structures, and assert their own identities within the classroom. For example, Hyunmi uses culturally loaded Korean terms like sunung and gukyeongsu to explain social concepts that English can't capture as precisely. This is not just about translation, it's an act of cultural grounding. Ji-young and Mina fluidly move between Korean and English in a classroom conversation. When Ji-young refers to learning skills but mixes 학습, Mina immediately affirms, that was natural. Their interaction reveals an internal classroom culture where bilingual fluidity is not only normalized but actually celebrated. This directly pushes back against what Flores and Rosa call ratio-linguistic ideologies, or beliefs that only standardized English is academically appropriate and that anything else is a marker of deficiency. Students like Songwon further illustrate this. When explaining Game Changer, he switches mid-sentence to Korean to clarify his meaning. It's not about a lack of knowledge in this case, it's about maintaining flow, clarity, and audience understanding within the classroom interaction. In these moments, students are not confused or code switching out of desperation. They are exercising agency, positioning themselves as competent multilingual communicators who refuse to marginalize their own identities to meet institutional expectations. A third major theme was how translanguaging reduced foreign language anxiety, or FLA. Students consistently reported that being able to use Korean in class made them feel safer, more comfortable, and more confident. Mina expressed this clearly when she stated many Korean students are afraid of making mistakes in front of others, and using another language increases the chance of saying something wrong. Her comment reflects a deeper emotional reality. Foreign language anxiety is not just about grammar, it's about shame, visibility, and vulnerability. Nayeon said simply, speaking English is burdensome, and Peter added that English-only classes are more burdensome. Translanguaging for them is an emotional coping strategy. This aligns with studies that argue how translanguaging creates emotionally safe spaces, where learners can regulate their affective states while still participating academically. Jong Hyun took this even further. He warned that English-only instruction might actually cause trauma. He said, if the class is adjusted to be English-only, it can cause trauma. If I could do it in a comfortable way, I'll use English more naturally. These aren't trivial comments, they're calls for humane pedagogy. When we ignore the emotional toll of language ideologies, we risk creating environments that not only hinder learning, but actually harm students' well-being. Interestingly, humor emerged as a recurring feature of students' translanguaging practices. Ji-young, for example, jokingly said, easy, normal easy, and Mina quipped, because they have me. Narcissist kate. These comments may seem lighthearted, but they reflect deep truths about classroom dynamics. Humor becomes a tool for building community, deflecting anxiety, and positioning oneself as a confident multilingual speaker. Research points out that humor can be a powerful pedagogical strategy, reducing stress and strengthening peer bonds. What we see here was students using humor to reclaim agency. They weren't just passive recipients of language, They were actually active shapers of the classroom's emotional tone. The embodied nature of language is particularly evident here. These students weren't just learning English, they were performing, negotiating, and inhabiting new identities in real time. And in those moments of laughter, they were asserting a powerful truth, that multilingualism isn't a deficit, it's a resource, a joy, a form of resistance, and a pathway to belonging. So to summarize, translanguaging is not just about comprehension, it's about identity. Students use their FLRs, or their full linguistic repertoires, to manage emotional states, to assert cultural belonging, and to navigate academic participation. These practices push back against monolingual ideologies and reveal language as an embodied phenomenon, deeply tied to students' lived experiences. As Garcia points out or reminds us, multilingual students don't carry separate languages in neat boxes. They move through language, they feel through language, and they construct meaning from their entire repertoire they live within. What's clear is that translanguaging isn't a workaround or a crutch. It's a right, a resource, and a resistance strategy. And when we recognize that, we create classrooms where multilingual identities are not only visible, but celebrated. So what does this mean for practice? Well, teachers should look at embracing translanguaging to create emotionally safe and inclusive classrooms, especially where language anxiety is common. And we've seen accounts in the data here that tends to suggest that this is what students actually prefer. Rigid English-only policies basically are marginalizing students' identities, and so promoting a translanguaging safe space allows them to reassert their agency within the learning environment. Educators should affirm students' rights to use all their linguistic resources. And to help build on this, teacher education programs must look at preparing instructors to see translanguaging not as a failure, but as a valid and empowering pedagogical strategy that they can use to help include or build inclusive learning environments within their own classrooms. The construction of inclusive learning environments leads to more positive language identity construction, more agency development in terms of the students and the languages they're learning, and challenges the dominant discourses that tend to shape ELT in general. So that brings us to the end of my talk. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this talk has shown you or shown us how translanguaging is not only a teaching tool, but it's also a means for students to reclaim their linguistic agency and to reshape what it means for them to participate in English language classrooms via the constructions of more positive learning identities with the right to recall and participate as they see academically appropriate as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts or questions, and I look to seeing those in the comments section. Thank you.